Hello, my name is Andrew, and today we're doing a comparison between the Vivobarefoot Tracker and the Blanka winter boot. So let's start with Vivobarefoot because there are actually 3 styles in the tracker that have slightly different features. This is the new Vivobarefoot Tracker AT Moc, and it has kind of like a Native American moccasin design, which I think looks really cool. Kind of like the Blanka, it's got a full leather upper, has very traditional look to it, but then it's got a lighter colored sole, so kind of like traditional modern blend, which looks really cool in my opinion. The toe box is wide. It does get a little bit more slim towards the tip, but it's fairly squared off, which is nice. And the leather is very squishy, as well as the sole, which kind of gives you a little more room to bend. It is a bit lower volume on the top, I think, compared to some of the other trackers, which we'll talk about. But the leather is fairly soft. It feels really nice on your feet. Even though it looks like a higher, heavier boot, it's actually very flexible. You can crush this thing and blend it and bend it in any direction. I also like this wavy design that they've got going on, because a lot of times with higher cut boots with a little bit thicker materials, they can like crimp. But what the wavy design allows for is that when your foot is bending, it kind of absorbs some of that stretch so that the fabric's not bending in weird ways. Also has a gusseted tongue, which is awesome for water resistance. And inside it's lined with wool, both on the tongue and then deeper into the boot, as you can see right there. It's got a leather lining on the bottom, which feels really good. A lot of times I'll put a thin wool insole like this in there. It doesn't really take up much room, which is great, especially with a lower volume boot where you don't have as much room to work with. But it's very insulating, moisture wicking, and also antimicrobial, so it doesn't smell. You can just put it out in the sunlight and it'll bake away the bacteria, which is great. But I also use merino wool socks by Injinji, and these are nice because they spread out your toes. They've got really good airflow, and that's especially important where you're wearing multiple layers. Like I usually will put a thicker smart wool over top of there if it's really cold. And when you combine that with a wool lined boot that's also leather, it feels really warm. I can get these down to around 20 degrees, 15 degrees. I was out about 25 today, and they're almost verging on too hot. I had the wool felt insole, and then some Injinjis and smart wools, and it was very warm. I also like the dip that they've got in the back here, because it is a slightly higher cut boot, but this gives you a little more range of motion back there. And then in terms of the Native American moccasin design, I think it looks really cool. The only thing that I don't like about it is that it tends to trap moisture right around here, just because you have that ridge, but there's no way to get around that, because that's just what a Native American moccasin looks like. Fortunately, the leather is really water resistant, so I find that even if I get some snow sitting up on here that starts to melt, it doesn't really penetrate through, it just gets kind of damp on top. And then if it gets damp inside the boot, it's got a wool lining right there, so it does a really good job of dispersing moisture throughout the boot, so you don't feel that soggy feeling. Also, even though it gets a little bit more slim towards the back, I actually like this because it holds my ankle very well, and because it's so soft, there's no pinching anywhere, which can happen with some of the other tracker boots, which we'll talk about. But the Tracker AT Moc also has some really nice lace locks, so if you snap them in position, the laces don't go anywhere, which is really convenient when you're lacing them up. And there are also some perforation holes here in the leather, which really helps with breathability. But in terms of the sole, it's 6.5 millimeters. This is Vivobarefoot's new AT, aka all terrain sole. It's got some really good flexibility to it. Pretty much everywhere in the boot, except maybe right at the very tip, because it does have a bit wider, kind of more meaty lugs. These are really good for going on super rocky terrain where it would beat up any kind of sole that was not quite as thick. But there's still plenty of room there where it grips on slippery terrain and also lets a bit of ground feel in there. So even though the lugs are more dense, especially when you start to bend it, there's a lot of space there for little pebbles and sticks, just to give you that sense that you're on a trail, which I like. The lugs get a bit wider and denser in the back, which is good for protection going downhills, when your heel's hitting there. And they also have a chevron shape, which helps grip going up hills, kind of like a claw. But I do find that because the lugs have these little nibs built into them, they can be slippery on something like just a completely flat wet rock or wet boardwalk. And overall, I think they're better for more hardcore terrain, rather than walking on roads, because the lugs can feel a little bit like overkill. And then last note, it is a stitched sole all the way around, which is great for long-term durability. Next up, Vivobarefoot also has the Tracker Leather AT. This is pretty much the same thing, but it's got a little bit more durable leather upper, a little more resistant to scratches. On the inside, it still has that leather lining, but it's lined with cotton, so it's a bit more mid-temperature. You know, you can get it down to freezing and maybe up to around 70 degrees, so a bit higher temperature range than the Moc, which is a bit more winter-centric, you know, but same lace hooks, you know, gusseted tongue, all the same features. It does have a little bit more pinch in the ankle, especially when you first get it. The leather, like I said, is a little more durable, so that's one of the reasons for it, but still a lot of really good flexibility. Another reason for that is that they've added this guard all the way around, so this is a bit more rugged boot compared to the Moc. It's going to stand up to, you know, scratching and also water. When you have this guard up higher, it's great for dealing with medium depth puddles and stuff like that. These are one of the most waterproof boots I have because of that. And although it's a glued sole, this is kind of Vivo's thought, is that if they have this wider rubber portion, it gives you something better for the sole to grip onto, as opposed to the leather, which is a little bit softer and more flexible. And sometimes when you go from the sole straight onto the leather, you can get separation, but I've never had any separation with these or with the Winter SG, which we're going to talk about as well. But these also have the same AT sole, which again is really good for rugged terrain, but not so much for roads. Also, I haven't tried it yet, but Vivo Barefoot also has a Tracker AT. This is the original version with the FG2 sole, but it's kind of the same thing. This is one of the few boots that is actually rated for being completely waterproof because it has a membrane in it, and I'll keep you guys updated when I actually do the review on the new version. Finally, we've got the Vivo Barefoot Tracker Winter SG, and this is kind of the same thing. It's got that same wraparound guard as the leather AT, also gusseted tongue. And it's kind of like a blend of the Moc and the leather because it has the wool insulation plus the guard. But then for the sole, it's got a 7.5mm tread. It's a little bit deeper. The lugs are a little more spaced out, so they're really good for wet, slushy conditions and really steep hills where you need a ton of grip. I really like this tread pattern because it is fully like having a set of winter claws, you know? It doesn't have as much grip on like flat, slippery surfaces like, you know, boardwalks and stuff like that because there's just not as much surface area. Although it can handle a bit of rocky terrain as long as that's not your main thing. You know, I would say it's mostly for snow and slush. And it does feel really good walking on roads actually because the sole is so flexible, you know? It actually feels softer than the AT sole. You just have to be careful about not scuffing it, you know, as long as you're rolling down smoothly. I think it's a boot that you could actually use for casual. And then one last note, I feel like there is just a little more volume in this one, which is great for stacking up socks. All right, so let's move on to the Lenka winter boot. This is the warmest barefoot boot that I own because it's got a super thick wool lining. It's not just wool, it's actually merino wool, which is even softer. And it's not a huge deal because if you're wearing a layer of socks or even two socks, you're probably not going to feel a more scratchy wool like Vivo Barefoot has, but it is nice to have, and merino wool is a little bit more breathable. It's just a little bit higher performing than normal wool, which I love. And a lot of times, like if it's 30 degrees, I can just get away with wearing a single layer of sock because the insulation is so thick, you know, it feels really amazing. It has a full leather upper. It's a bit softer, so it kind of reminds me of the Vivo Barefoot Tracker AT Moc, you know, because it's a bit more casual oriented. But the one difference with Blanket is that they have a extra wide toe box. You can see that it just has more width than Vivo Barefoot does. Although I will say that there is a lot of insulation in here, so it takes up some room. I would say it's like a half step down from full extra wide, you know, because of that, but there's still more room in here than Vivo Barefoot. One thing I don't like is that the laces are kind of dinky, you know, like you've got this, you know, fairly rugged boot, but then you've got these lightweight laces and they've never broken for me. And like I said, it's more of a casual boot, so it's not a big deal, but something to note. And then also with the lace locks up here, I find that they just don't really hold as well when you're putting the boot on, and sometimes they can fall off. So you might want to replace the laces with something thicker if you're, you know, if you're worried about that, if you want something that's a little bit more performative. But overall, it feels really great. It's super flexible, very soft. There's nothing pressing anywhere. If you wear the stock insole they give you, it's kind of thick, and I didn't really like it for that reason. I mean, it's super warm, but it just takes up too much room in the boot. So again, I just use a thin wool felt insole, and then most of the time I can get away with just a single pair of Injinjis, but it can accommodate multiple layers of socks if you're like down below 0 degrees or something like that. But another thing I like about this boot is that it's highly water resistant. I think when they first started selling it, they said it was waterproof, and I would agree with that. It seems to keep everything out, even when I go in slushy puddles and stuff like that. One thing to note is that the glued sole can separate. Like there's a tiny bit of separation after a year right here where the boot bends. and it's not really enough that I need to glue it yet. It doesn't seem to be letting in water either, which is great. But if you have that happen, you can always take a little bit of shoe goo, you know, any kind of shoe glue product, and then just lightly clamp it here for 24 hours, and that can usually fix any problems. In terms of the sole, it's 8 millimeters, which I really like. I feel like it's not super thick where it feels clunky, but it's got a ton of really good flexibility, because you can see they've cut lines here, which gives it some good horizontal flexibility. And then the lugs run in a cross pattern like this, which gives it some great vertical flexibility. And then I really like this lug pattern too, because it's got enough room to really grip well. This is one of the most grippy boots that I have for like wet, slushy, super steep hills, you know, because it's very claw-like. But then they're oriented in different directions, you know, for going up hills here, and then in a different direction for going downhill. And then also they're sort of like bent inwards, you know what I mean? Like some treads, like Vivobarefoot, for example, it's just a straight tread. You know, you can see that the lug pattern just goes straight in like this. But with the lenka, the tread is almost like bent, you know. And what this does is that when you're walking on roads, it feels very smooth. You almost get some like padding here. Even when I'm just wearing thin wool felt insole, it feels like I've got just a tiny amount of cushion, which feels amazing for walking on hard roads with a thicker sole like this, which sometimes can feel really clunky. And that is the case with the AT sole. And partly it's just because it's meant to be a more rugged sole, and this is a softer rubber, which would get chewed up more on, you know, super rocky terrain. Stuff like that, but it is nice for walking around the city all day. All right, so those are the pros and cons of the Vivobarefoot Tracker versus the Blanca winter boot. But if you'd like to support the channel, you can shop with the referral links down below. Browse and filter more products with the shoe finder tool, my website barefootwear.org, or watch my zero drop transition video to learn more about barefooting. Finally, if you have a question about Vivobarefoot or Blanca or about barefoot shoes in general, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time. Peace.